Here you can watch Illustrator using color pencils to draw a fabric. The motifs are floral and show many colors. Right now the illustrator is using blue color pencil very near to a dark blue rendering. The illustrator is actually creating a striped pattern by filling the white space in between dark blue triangles. Observe carefully the illustrator's control on the color pencil. You can see that the strokes are done in a very limited space. The illustrator does not exceed the space. This kind of control is absolutely necessary while rendering such intricate details and designs. Watch the to and fro movement of the color pencil. This kind of movement makes the rendering as even as possible. Consistency makes an important part of this rendering, as the most attractive parts in this particular rendering are geometrical. They are also very tiny in comparison. Observe carefully how the illustrator is using a gray pencil to fill a large amount of space. Note that the illustrator is not completely filling the vacant areas, but rather uses the pencil in such a way that very little gray is applied on the surface of the paper. The resultant effect is that those spaces look very light gray and almost white. These are the types of techniques you should practice as a fashion illustrator, because you will be coming across many such colors which look almost white, or in other words, they are known as off white. Now the illustrator is using yellow color in the border areas. Watch thoroughly the circular motion and to and fro motion of the color pencil. This kind of rendering creates evenness in the colors that are applied. Note the evenness of the patches of colors applied. You can see orange petals, light, medium, and dark blue petals, and some circular dots. Here, all the patches look even. This is more suitable for printed fabrics where limited number of colors are applied. Most of the time, such colors are flat in nature. So, the illustrator has to evenly apply colors to make the rendering look attractive. Here, the illustrator is seen using soft dry pastels. The material being rendered is pile fabric. It is yellow in color with piles on the surface. Pile is nothing but the loose fibers that can be seen on the surface of the fabric. Here, observe carefully how the illustrator is using soft dry pastels. Already a ground yellow is applied, on top of which the illustrator has applied a darker shade of yellow which combine with the background yellow and gives a very natural look resembling the pile fabric kept for reference. You can see the mixing of colors on the surface of the paper. The beauty about soft dry pastels is that mixing can be done effortlessly. However, the medium tends to be bold. You can see that the illustrator has drawn many lines resembling the pile fabric. While drawing pile fabrics, it's very important that you get to see the feel of the fabric. Watch how the illustrator is using finger to mix the light yellow and orangish shade. One must be very careful to also show the light and shadow variations in the rendering to resemble the actual fabric. Watch the evenness of each and every stroke that the illustrator is doing. The illustrator is using only orange and yellow at the moment to recreate the color of the fabric. The illustrator is now using white in certain areas to lighten the color. Here the illustrator can be seen using a darker shade to add depth to the rendering, which makes the rendering look more three-dimensional. Here the illustrator can be seen rendering denim fabric which has twill weave and is indigo in color. This particular fabric has a faded look. So you see a used fabric that has various hues of blue. As it is fading, the difference between these blues is that there is very little contrast between these colors. So one has to be very careful while rendering such faded fabrics. In this case, you have white which is actually faded indigo. Then you have medium blues and dark blues. So watch the rendering where the middle portion of the rendering is more white while the sides are much darker. So the way you do the rendering will decide whether your rendering is going to look more three-dimensional. Here you are watching one of the illustrators rendering crepe fabric using poster colors. Observe the workmanship of the illustrator using a round thin brush. One must note here that while rendering with poster colors, you will have absolute control over the medium. You must be able to draw thin lines, fill colors, and also apply textures or patterns. You must be ready to do intricate workmanship like the dots that the illustrator is doing. You can see that the illustrator is doing quick brush strokes to draw lines as well as add texture in the rendering. You must be very careful with the brush and have complete control on the brush. Here you can see thin lines being drawn at a very fast pace. Observe carefully how the illustrator has drawn some straight lines and created dots in between the lines. Here you can see that the illustrator is drawing small curvatures even though there is no pencil outline. So you must be having enough practice to draw such small and intricate patterns on the go. You can also observe the pointedness of the brush and how the illustrator controls the brush to draw as per the illustrator's visualization. Carefully observe how the illustrator is applying poster colors in a very consistent manner. You must be very careful to not create inconsistencies while applying poster color. Poster colors always look absolutely even without any patches. Here you are watching the illustrator applying a brown shade. A pencil outline has already been drawn so that it's much easier to fill the various shapes. Here the illustrator is using round tipped brush to draw a pattern. Here you are watching the illustrator using poster colors to render a crepe fabric. Though the rendering looks very colorful, it must be noted here that while using poster colors, especially to render fabrics, a palette of colors is already chosen. The number of colors are very limited. So the illustrator has to use only, for example, 5 or 6 colors in total to create this kind of rendering. Here the illustrator is using round tipped thin brush to draw this intricate floral pattern. Observe the workmanship of the illustrator, the control the illustrator has on the brush, the confidence with which the illustrator is working. Closely observe how the illustrator is drawing leaves and stems using a very thin brush. You can see that too much of pressure is not being applied on the brush. Rather, only the tip of the brush is used to fill colors. Such qualities can be developed through extensive practice. Dear students, you have been watching many mediums with which the illustrators have been rendering many materials. Now I am going to quickly take you through a series of materials and mediums so that you get to see a lot of variety in the materials and mediums which the fashion illustrators are using to do their renderings. I hope it will give you a clear picture of how to use various mediums to render a variety of materials. Here you are watching a checked pattern of fabric that is rendered using various blue tones. The illustrator has actually enlarged the size of the checks so that it can be rendered properly. If you watch each and every square, you will find that two of them don't resemble each other. A lot of tonal variation is given in these checks, and later on the checks are included with small stripes, either horizontal, vertical, or diagonal, to make the rendering look more realistic. Now observe carefully how this rendering gives the feel of the fabric rather than the exact size of the checks visible on the fabric. So this kind of keen observation and representational skills will have to be developed by the fashion illustrator. Here you are watching synthetic lace, a kind of fabric which resembles a net. The rendering is done using color pencils. Here you can note that the shapes of the flowers are visible through white spaces which act as outlines. So this kind of rendering has to be pre-planned well in advance. Also note the intricate lines and the quality of rendering to make the rendering look as realistic as possible, and it also closely resembles the synthetic lace that's kept as reference. Here you are watching a fabric which has a border. The border has zari in it. The rendering is done using color pencils. As you can see, the zari reflects a lot of light and the rendering has to be done accordingly. Most of the border areas in fabrics is made of intricate patterns. So all these intricacies will have to be rendered as realistic as possible. Here you can see that the illustrator has shown as much detail as possible, especially for the border pattern where you can clearly see the woven structure that is visible on the fabric. Now You are watching a rendering of jute fabric using color pencils. As you can see, the jute fabric reflects light in a very subtle manner. You can see both dark as well as light in that small piece of fabric. If you watch the rendering carefully, you will see that the rendering is done according to the texture of the jute fabric. You can see many lines that are drawn as if reproducing all the yarns that are visible in the actual fabric. So this kind of intricate detail must be applied to show the fabric as realistic as possible. Watch the subtle difference between the colors used as well as the analogous color scheme that has been used. You will find that there are no contrasting colors that are applied. So your aim must be to produce a rendering that will closely resemble the fabric and the feel of the fabric. Right now you are watching a rendering of a cotton fabric using poster colors. Here one must be very careful while rendering the motifs. For example, in this particular fabric, you can see some paisley motifs. The rendering is done in such a way that it's very difficult to differentiate between the original fabric and the rendering. Therein lies the success of the illustrator. Watch carefully the uniformity of the pattern, the application of poster colors without variations, or in other words, patches. This uniformity in application of poster colors makes this rendering very good in appearance. Here you are watching a rendering done using watercolors. The fabric rendered is a polyester blend fabric. Closely observe the workmanship of the renderer using watercolors. All the details of the folds of the fabric are captured in a very beautiful manner by the illustrator. You can see that light and shadow are created right next to each other so that the rendering looks more natural. You can feel the texture of the fabric as well as the softness of the fabric. As a fashion illustrator, creating a feel of the fabric is of utmost importance. Here you are watching the rendering of acrylic pile fabric. It is done using soft, dry pastels. If you watch the fabric properly, you will see that the fabric has a lot of fibers on the surface. This is one of the most important qualities of pile fabrics. So, at the time of rendering, you will have to make sure that the fibers or piles are visible on the surface of the fabric, as well as the smoothness or hardness of the fabric must be visible in the rendering. So here the illustrator has used various tints and shades of yellow to create the pile fabric kept for reference. Closely observe the many lines that the illustrator has rendered to depict the fabric as realistically as possible. You can observe here that the illustrator has used color pencils to render a piece of leather. You must note here that unlike textiles, leather has different kinds of textures, and these textures are never going to be very uniform. For example, the rendering that you are watching right now has squarish shapes, big and small, distributed in a certain manner. So, the fashion illustrator must thoroughly observe these kinds of textures, the sizes of the shapes, how the colors are distributed on the surface of the leather, and such information. The illustrator must make sure that first a thorough investigation of the material kept is undertaken, understood, inherited, and then represented in a very systematic manner. Here you can see that the texture of the leather is rendered in two different phases, one being small squarish shapes and the other being big rectangular shapes. Also watch the interplay of tints and shades in this rendering. Both light red and dark red are applied in a very intricate manner to show all the details of the leather piece that's kept for reference. Here you are watching the rendering of rayon material using soft pastels. You can see that the colors used are yellow, orange and red with some dark brown applications. Also watch the folds that are rendered as per the reference rayon material. The folds of the fabric have been observed carefully and then rendered using soft dry pastels. There is an interplay of light and shadow in the rendering that makes the rendering look more attractive. Here you can see a rendering of a leather piece using black dry pastel. If you watch carefully, you can see that the rendering has huge highlighted areas as well as dark areas where there is no reflection of light. The lines seen actually resemble the kind of textures seen on the leather piece. So the illustrator has to first observe the leather piece properly, understand the textures on the surface of the leather, and then render those textures as realistically as possible. As only one pastel is used, you don't have the luxury of depicting that leather piece using many colors. Here, importance must be given to light and shadow rather than colors. Here, you are watching the color pencil rendering of a cotton polyester blended fabric. You can see that the fabric has a checked pattern. You can see a combination of blue, blue plus white, blue plus black, and so on. So here the illustrator has applied blue color pencil as ground, on top of which the illustrator has applied various shades of black. Apart from these color combinations, you can also see that certain yarns are visible in contrast to the ground fabric. So all these details must be included in your rendering. Here the illustrator has done this by drawing black lines wherever possible and also added gray lines according to the fabric kept as reference. So closely watch the techniques used here, which show the check pattern in a very subtle manner. Here you are watching a synthetic fabric which has been rendered using watercolors. The specialty of this fabric is that it has surface development techniques which are more three-dimensional in nature. The surface quality of the material is such that without the three-dimensional qualities, it might not look realistic. The feel of these three-dimensional aspects must be clearly rendered by the illustrator. So, the illustrator has used watercolors here to show all these three-dimensional qualities. Especially if you watch this rendering carefully, adjacent to the circular shapes, you can see that a lot of darkness is being used, especially the edges of the circles are rendered with some of the darkest shades. So it's the combination of these dark shades and the pink ground color that make this rendering more realistic and actually depicts the feel of the fabric. Here you are watching the rendering of a cotton fabric using color pencils. If you observe carefully, you will note that the fabric is actually light in color. The browns that you see on the fabric are actually the shaded portions of the fabric. The illustrator has cleverly rendered the actual color of the fabric rather than the light and shadow visible on the fabric. You can see that the rendering is a combination of vertical and horizontal lines. These lines are used to resemble the structure of the fabric kept for reference. As you can see, the texture of the fabric is also visible in the rendering, thus giving a feel of the fabric. Here you are watching a synthetic fabric which has a jacquard woven pattern where zari is used. As zari is used, you can see that there's a lot of shine in the motifs. So the illustrator has used dry pastels to render this synthetic fabric which has jacquard motifs. If you watch the rendering thoroughly, you will note that the ground color is used as red. This red again has been included with darker shades so that the ground fabric has a lot of light and shadow, which actually helps in enhancing the jacquard motifs using orange and light red. Here the illustrator has made the motifs in a very subtle manner so that too many details are not given, but rather the feel of the fabric is rendered. the viewer can actually feel the zari as well as the details that are woven using the jacquard. So this is a clever method of showing the details on the fabric without actually rendering each and every detail in a very intricate manner. Here, observe a knit fabric that's kept for reference. The rendering is done using pencil. If you watch the knit fabric properly, you will see that the knit fabric is made up of two parts. One has lines as a pattern, the other side has small shapes as pattern. Here the illustrator has closely observed both these patterns and rendered them using pencil. You can clearly see the construction of the knit fabric. You can also almost count all the yarns used to do the knitting. So, wherever you have such knit fabrics, according to the merits of the yarn used, you might render all the details in a very clear manner. Here you are watching a satin fabric rendered using black dry pastel. As satin has the quality to reflect a lot of light, the illustrator has combined light and shadow in this rendering to give a feel of the fabric. Here the illustrator has keenly observed the folds characteristic to the fabric and rendered them as realistically as possible. Though black is used in the rendering, you will see that it's a combination of white, which is the surface color of the paper, and which combine to illustrate the feel of the satin fabric. Here you can see that the illustrator has rendered satin fabric using dry pastels. But unlike the previous illustration, here you don't see much highlights or the folds of the fabric. So it's up to the illustrators to decide on how you would like to render your materials. Here you are watching a rendering done using poster colors. Material kept for reference is crepe. Crepe is nothing but a crisp fabric. Here you can see that the fabric has a lot of red, dark red, black and yellow. Here the rendering is done closely resembling the fabric. As you can see, there are a lot of details visible in the fabric. So the illustrator has chosen the right medium, namely poster colors, which are more conducive to render such details. Here you are watching a rendering using colored pencils. The fabric kept for reference is a knit fabric. As you see, there is an orange border in the fabric which shows a lot of texture. So the illustrator has rendered both these textures, one of which is a kind of orange and the other one is a dark blue. So if you watch carefully, you will find that the illustrator has tried and included as much detail as possible where you can actually see the pattern that is knitted. Here you are watching a rendering done using watercolors of a piece of leather. As you can see, it's the feel of the leather that is being rendered rather than showing all the details on the surface of the leather. You can see that subtle variations of colors are used, namely orange, red, yellow, and brown. So one has to be very quick and thorough in doing such renderings. As the medium used is watercolor, it tends to dry in a very fast manner. So the illustrator has taken advantage of this medium, done absolutely quick sketches to show the leather as realistically as possible. Here you are watching a silk fabric that is rendered using color pencils. As you can see, this particular silk fabric seems to have a lot of intricate patterns woven into it. So the illustrator has to show all the details in a very clear-cut manner. Otherwise, the feel of the silk fabric might be lost. So one has to first keenly observe all the details and then render them as realistically as possible. As you can see here, the background maroon color actually highlights the patterns in zari that are visible as attractive as possible. Here you are watching the rendering of a leather piece using color pencil. As you can observe very clearly, this leather piece has texture as its main content. There is no color difference on the surface of the leather, but you can clearly see a texture which can be really felt when you touch this piece of leather. The illustrator has cleverly used a ground brown on top of which he has applied various shades of brown. The subtle variation of these shades creates a visual picture that realistically matches the tactile texture of the leather that's kept for reference. Watch the light and shadow in the application of textures. Certain dots are dark while certain other dots are medium or light in color. This combination of light and dark colors renders the texture of the leather as realistically as possible. It also looks more natural, just like the leather that's kept for reference. Here you are watching silk cotton fabric which is rendered using watercolor on snow white board. As the fabric is of single color, the illustrator has given more importance to the tones visible on the surface of the fabric. So he has chosen watercolor medium. You can clearly see the subtle variations in yellow, orange and dark brown used by the illustrator. Small lines can be seen which closely resemble the creases on the fabric. This is what makes the rendering look more realistic. Here you are watching the rendering of crepe fabric using B pencils. B pencils are soft in nature, so the illustrator has created the rendering using B pencils. As the fabric is of single color, importance is given to the tones that are visible on the fabric. The creases on the fabric are also depicted as realistically as possible. This kind of pencil rendering actually develops your skills to observe the tonal variations on the surface of any material. So, the preferred medium must be B pencils, which are available in various numbers like B, 1B, 2B, 3B, 4B, and up to 12B. It is up to you to choose the pencil of your choice. Here you are watching the rendering of a printed cotton fabric using soft dry pastels. As you can see, a ground yellow has been applied with a lot of tonal variations. On top of that, the floral motif is rendered as intricately as possible. So the rendering looks more realistic, and you also see the floral pattern as clearly as possible. The feel of the fabric is also visible up to an extent. Here you are seeing knit cotton fabric. Only when you observe carefully, you will find that a check pattern is visible on the fabric. The illustrator has done a commendable job by observing this check pattern and rendering it using color pencils. As you can see, the fabric is a bluish gray, inside which you see this check pattern. The difference between the check and the ground is very little. One has to be keenly observing this fabric to see this checked pattern. The illustrator has rendered this check pattern in such a way that it is visible as a very dull check pattern in the rendering. So as a fashion illustrator, you will be coming across very similar fabrics or other materials where it might be very difficult to differentiate the patterns. So as a fashion illustrator, you must develop a keen eye to differentiate such subtle differences in the fabrics. Thank you.